examined ways to reform the American prison system. We now want to take a closer look at the inner workings of U.S. federal and state penitentiaries. How do they operate? How widespread are human rights violations in these facilities? And is the American criminal justice system stacked against African Americans and Hispanics? Joining me now from New York is Jamie Fellner. She's a senior advisor to the U.S. program of Human Rights Watch. She specializes in criminal justice issues, including prison conditions. Joining me here in the studio is Pat Nolan. He was a state lawmaker in California for 15 years. He also spent nearly 2.5 years in a federal prison on corruption charges. He's now president of Justice Fellowship, an organization dedicated to changing the U.S. criminal justice system. And I want to welcome both of you to the show. Jamie, why don't I begin with you? Let's talk about what it's like for these convicts in the penitentiary. We've heard some horror stories. You deal with human rights abuses. Give us a snapshot. How bad is it?
Well, I think the public may still have in mind a notion of prisons as being places of extreme and unrelenting violence, including violence by staff. And certainly there are some prisons that deserve that reputation. I think the more prevalent set of problems have to do with these are overcrowded, barren facilities with nothing for the men and women in them to do, with certainly unacceptably high rates of sexual abuse and other forms of violence. But the overwhelming sense is the futility, the emptiness, the lack of purpose for the incarceration of so many people. It's not a dramatic story, although there are dramatic stories to tell, but the bigger picture is one of a waste of human lives, of human potential, a waste of taxpayer money, and a lack of contribution to public safety.
Well, Pat, let me ask you, because you go at this from a different point of view, I would think. Here you are, a lawmaker, you're a policy guy, you probably had one viewpoint, suddenly here you are in the prison outfit and you're in prison. What kind of an epiphany did you have?
It was a total eye-opener. As a legislator, I'd been very interested in prisons. I'd visited 9 different prisons while I was in the legislature. But what you see on the tours with the warden leading is very different than what you see as an inmate. And what Jamie described is right. The instances of physical abuse by staff or inmates is there, but more important is the lack of hope. While I was in prison well over 1,000 times, I was told, "You ain't got nothing coming," and it's said with a sneer. And the intention is to tell you, you come from nothing, you are nothing, you will be nothing. Now, I come from a good family. I'd had a position of responsibility and authority. I had a good education. So as much as that hurt, I was able to withstand it. Think of a kid who came from an abusive household, that ran away when he was 14, that got involved in the drug culture, and has never had anybody in their life tell them they love them and that they're worthwhile. They begin to believe that they ain't got nothing coming, that the future is hopeless. And then, as Jamie said, the hours of idleness. I said, the twin curses of idleness and boredom, that's prison life. And I would much rather be busy doing something than just this enforced idleness. And yet the prisons are so crowded, there's no room for programming. In California, the famous lawsuit that the Supreme Court decided, one of the prison facilities had 85 prisoners and 1 toilet for them to share.
Well, let me ask you, I want to ask both of you about this. I've been to a lot of prisons in the West Coast and Midwest, and it's almost like the cast there in the prison were sent over from central casting, because you can go to any prison in the United States and you see a lot of the same types of people. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. And we do see this where it's people of color in these prisons, and you mentioned it. They may be coming from hard luck neighborhoods, and they end up in this cycle. How do we stop it? I mean, and
Mike,
is that the case?
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, I think it's important when you're looking at the prison population as a whole, and I still think the American public believes most people in prison are bad guys, are violent guys. What's truly distressing in the American sort of phenomena of mass incarceration is that 1 in 3 people going into prison and about 20% of people in prison have done nothing less than nonviolent drug crimes. And one of the things that I think Pat and I both would hope would come from the current fiscal crisis, and which we are starting to see in certain states at least, is that legislators and policymakers start asking themselves, what is the purpose of prison? Who do we want to have to spend time in prison? And are there other ways of holding people accountable than sending, for, again, low-level drug offenders
Jamie,
to prison?
to interrupt you, the answer is there are other options, and yet this system is pretty loused up. And one would say, the appearances, if you're looking from the outside, you don't live here in the United States, is it looks like a racist system.
But, it's...
Well, it is racist in this, Mike, let me say, it is, I think it's important to sort of sort out, again, what sends people to prison. I think there's no question that drug law enforcement is just racially discriminatory. The police go into low-income black neighborhoods to make the arrests, and not surprisingly, low-income black and Hispanic people end up in prison at far higher rates than whites, even though they have comparable rates of drug offending. When you look at other kinds of crimes, you still see racial disparities, and there the racial disparities aren't caused necessarily by racially disparate law enforcement, but because people who are low income have far fewer opportunities to make it in this world, and unfortunately with the current economic situation, the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting rich, and the middle class are being squeezed down. And over time, this is going to have reflections in deepening the color divide in U.S. prisons.
Well, let me give Pat a chance to jump in here.
Well, first of all, a rubric we use is prisons are for people we're afraid of, but we're filling them with folks we're just mad at. A lot of these low-level crimes, we're angry. They aren't following the rules of society, but they're not a danger to us. You don't go to sleep at night worried about them. And there are other ways to punish them that hold them accountable, that frankly do a better job, that don't put them in with hardened criminals, which tends to, my mom used to say, vegetables take on the flavor of the stew pot. They're going to get worse by being in with violent criminals. Hold them accountable in the neighborhood, and there are programs that work at that, and save money. But also the impact of the laws are racially disparate. You don't have to come to the conclusion that they were passed for racial reasons, but you do have to face the reality that they are having a tremendous impact. There are whole swaths of our cities in which the adult males can't participate in civic engagement. They can't even vote because of convictions. And the likelihood is their children will be incarcerated too. How do we break that cycle? And part of it is prison fellowship goes into prisons and works with the inmates and says, you do have value. Whatever you did, Jesus paid the price for your sin. It's forgiven. We're here because we love you and we want you to do better, and we'll work with you to do that. And the fascinating thing is, as states begin to have a lack of money, they're turning to volunteers. We're providing these people that'll mentor, that'll help, and what inmates need more than programs is love, somebody to care about them.
Let me ask you this too, and then I'll get Jamie to jump in afterwards. But Sheriff Greg Hamilton of Travis County, in Austin, Texas, says, "It seems to me that we have criminalized being mentally ill." This is another major issue, isn't it? Talk to me about what you saw on the inside and what can be done to address it.
Well, even in the legislature, we in the 70s and beginning of the 80s.
I thought you were talking about legislators and mental illness. Sorry, Pat, I misunderstood where you were going.
The legislature had emptied our state mental hospitals. And by the time I got elected, we could see those same patients appearing on our streets, only they were called homeless. And there were no programs to put them in. So by default, the sheriff or police officer did what they called mercy bookings. They hadn't committed a crime. They got them off the streets, but they were put in jail. I got $1 million to LA County Jail to set up a forensic mental health facility to try to help them. But every police chief and sheriff will tell you, these are not bad people, they're sick. And we need acute care beds that they can be put into. And we need to focus on that. One of the problems is mental health dollars often go for people with minor life crises. Their boyfriend left them, they lost their job, they've lost a loved one. Those are all reasons to make us sad, but they don't make them dangerous. Those programs to help them are sucking up money that could to pay for the acutely mental ill, with acute beds to help them.
Jamie, we're just about out of time,
Mike,
but I do want to give you a chance to respond.
No, I've written extensively about the role of mental illness in U.S. prisons, and part of the problem is, as Pat was suggesting, is there is no vibrant, robust community mental health system that can take people who need help, who need emergency help or who need long-term help. They end up in the prison system, which at least provides a modicum, however poor, of mental health care. Somewhere between 20 and 50% of U.S. prison population has a serious mental illness. It's extraordinary, and it reflects the willingness of the U.S. people to put money into prisons that they aren't willing to put into strengthening communities and providing the social support services, be they mental health, medical, educational, vocational, that is needed.
Jamie, thank you for joining us from New York. Pat, thanks so much for stopping by our studios here and joining us here on The Heat.